Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to explore a rather dark, honestly kind of hilarious, and super practical survival guide to the pitch-black, chaotic nightlife of ancient Rome. Forget literally everything you know about spending an evening out on the town. Okay, let's dive into this.
When we think of nightlife today, we picture neon signs, bustling clubs, illuminated safe avenues, and maybe grabbing some midnight street food. It's supposed to be a time of relaxation and fun. But if we take a time machine back 2,000 years to Rome, a sprawling megalopolis crammed with over 1 million people, the picture changes entirely. The Roman Empire had absolutely zero public street lighting. None. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the city was plunged into this suffocating ink-black darkness. The ancient night wasn't some fun playground. As you navigated those pitch-black alleys, it was a terrifying literal fight for survival.
Section 1. The Empire of Noise. Dusk in ancient Rome. To really understand how chaotic this gets, we have to start at the exact moment the sun sets, the shops close, and the heavy machinery of the empire takes over.
Now, you might assume that a city without electricity just gets quiet at night, right? Well, you would be dead wrong. Rome at night was a deafening industrial hellscape. And we can actually blame Julius Caesar for that. In 45 BC, Caesar passed the Lex Julia Municipalis. See, the city was so horribly gridlocked during the day that he completely banned commercial wheeled carts from sunrise to dusk. The unintended consequence of this? The very second the sun went down, an apocalyptic rush of thousands of heavy, wooden carts, iron-shod mules, and screaming drivers flooded the narrow cobblestone streets just to deliver the grain, marble, and wine needed to keep 1 million people alive.
And trust me, the Romans complained about this constantly. Just look at this fantastic quote from the Roman satirist Juvenal. He ranted, "What sleep is possible in a lodging? The crossing of wagons in the narrow winding streets, the swearing of drovers brought to a standstill would snatch sleep from a sea calf or the Emperor Claudius himself." I mean, we've all been kept awake by noisy street traffic today, but imagine massive wooden wheels grinding over uneven basalt stones, literally just feet from your uninsulated apartment window. Juvenal actually blamed this relentless insomnia and exhaustion for the incredibly high death rate in the city.
Section 2. Pitch black and perilous, surviving the dark. So let's say you just can't sleep and you decide to leave your noisy apartment. We are now heading out into streets where simply stepping out your front door was considered an extreme status symbol.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between how the rich and the poor navigated this darkness. If you were wealthy, you never traveled alone. You moved with a literal army. You had lampadarii, which were slave torchbearers to light your path, right alongside heavily armed bodyguards. And you absolutely needed them, because the poor and the unprotected, they had to dodge grassatores, violent muggers hiding out in the pitch-black alleys. But muggers weren't the only threat, not even close. Rome was built up with insulae, these high-rise apartment buildings reaching up to 7 stories. With no indoor plumbing, residents just used chamber pots, and when those were full, well, look out below.
This brings us to a rather disgusting but honestly fascinating piece of Roman legislation, De Diectis Vel Effusis. Because human waste and heavy clay pots were constantly raining down from 6-story windows onto pedestrians, Roman law actually allowed you to sue for damages. If someone dumped our slop on you, you could take them to court. If a heavy clay pot actually killed your family member, you could sue for 50 gold coins. But there was a major catch here. It was pitch black outside. Good luck proving exactly which 6th-floor window that pot came from.
Section 3. Rome's First Night Watch. With crime running rampant and literal chamber pots falling from the sky, someone had to try to maintain order.
Enter the Vigiles Urbani. In 6 AD, Emperor Augustus created a specialized force made up of exactly 7,000 freedmen, former slaves actually, to act as the city's combined fire and police department.
But here's the thing. The vigiles were firefighters first and policemen second. Fire was the ultimate terror in Rome. A single knocked-over oil lamp could turn an entire wooden apartment block into a raging inferno in minutes. So the vigiles patrolled the dark streets carrying heavy, horse-drawn water pumps called siphones, heavy buckets, and axes. And sure, yes, they would break up tavern brawls and arrest burglars if they happened to see them, but their heavy equipment made them pretty useless at chasing down a quick mugger in a dark alley. If you screamed for help, by the time they arrived lugging those heavy water buckets, the thief was long gone.
Section 4. A tale of two parties, elite versus working class. Let's move to and see how this builds as we transition into midnight.
The streets are relatively clear of everyone except the watchmen and the muggers, so it's time to head indoors and look at the vastly unequal ways the rich and the poor actually partied. The wealth inequality of the Roman knight was staggering. If you were part of the 1%, you attended a convivium, a super elite dinner party. You wouldn't even sit up. You'd recline on plush triclinium couches while slaves served you completely bizarre, exotic delicacies. We're talking roasted dormice rolled in honey or flamingo tongues drenched in fermented fish blood called garum. You'd even elect a magister bibendi, a master of drinking, to dictate the water-to-wine ratios while you watched private gladiator fights. But what if you were a working-class plebeian? Well, you went to the Papanay. These were loud, smoky, fast food dive bars where you just sit on cheap wooden stools eating chickpeas and salted fish.
Okay, speaking of elite dinner parties, I have to enthusiastically debunk a massive historical myth right now. You have probably heard of a vomitorium, supposedly this special room where wealthy Romans would go to throw up so they could keep eating. Nope, that is entirely false. A vomitorium is actually just an architectural term for the exit passageways in stadiums like the Colosseum, simply because they spewed forth the crowds. Now, to be fair, the excess of the elite really knew no bounds, and they absolutely did vomit at these parties. But they didn't have a special room for it. They usually just threw up into a bowl held by a slave right next to the table, wiped their mouths, and kept right on eating. Disgusting, but completely true.
Meanwhile, back down in the working-class Papanay, the underground scene was thriving. Gambling for money was technically illegal, but frankly, nobody cared. Patrons huddled over six-sided dice called tesserae or four-sided knucklebones called tali, hoping for the ultimate lucky roll known as the Venus throw. Brawls constantly broke out over loaded dice, and if you wandered into the Suburra, Rome's notorious, super-cramped red light district, you'd find the lupanars, or brothels. Because Rome was a huge hub for travelers from all over the empire who couldn't necessarily read Latin, these establishments ingeniously used explicit visual frescoes painted right above the doors as literal menus for their services.
Section 5. The Supernatural Night, Ghosts, and Cults. We are now entering the darkest, most terrifying hours of the night. Because for an ancient Roman, physical dangers like muggers and fires, that was only half the problem. They were equally terrified of the supernatural.
So the crucial point is that Roman law dictated that no one could be buried inside the city walls. This meant that all the major roads leading out of Rome were lined with massive graveyards. Literally, stepping out of the city at night meant walking through cities of the dead. And the Romans firmly believed that when the sun went down, the boundary between the living and the dead thinned. They weren't just looking over their shoulders for falling clay pots. They were hiding from lemuras, restless, angry ghosts, or the Strix, a terrifying blood-drinking witch that turned into an owl, and secretive, wild cults like the Bacchanalia that performed dark rituals deep in the woods.
Because of this intense paranoia, Romans had highly specific and honestly kind of wild ways to protect themselves. Take the Lemuria ritual, which was designed to ward off angry ghosts from the home. First, the head of the household has to wake up at midnight and walk barefoot. Second, he puts black beans in his mouth and spits them over his shoulder without looking back, fully believing the ghost is going to follow him to pick them up. Third, he chants 9 times, "With these beans I redeem me and mine," and finally he forcefully closhes brands pots together to scare the spirit right out of the house. It's a bizarre, almost comical image to us today, tossing beans and banging pots, but I promise you, they took this nighttime spiritual warfare incredibly seriously.
And this brilliantly illustrates our chronological journey as the chaotic night finally ends. At dusk, the normal citizens lock their doors as heavy commercial carts flood the streets. At midnight, those extreme inequalities hit their peak, with elites throwing up into bowls at their convivium feasts, while commoners are busy performing superstitious bean-tossing rituals in the dark. Finally, at dawn, the exhausted vigils end their patrols, the shadows recede, and the sun rises over the glorious marble temples. The safe, orderly city wakes up.
Section 6. Surviving to Sunrise, the Roman Paradox, which brings us right into the morning light. The ancient Roman night perfectly encapsulates the ultimate paradox of the empire. By day, Rome was this unmatched marvel of engineering, glorious marble and orderly sunlight. But by night, it was a brutal, dark, and highly unequal fight for survival, where a single misstep in a pitch-black alleyway could cost you absolutely everything.
Please like and subscribe.